Like I remember one of John's antics of, he's like, I remember back in the day when you had to get board approval for a phone system, which is implying how expensive phone systems used to be. They were so expensive he would need board approval, and you know, having technology that lives outside of AWS is kind of relatively equivalently difficult. Back in the day, we weren't able to do things so easily, and so you kind of stifle free speech through just function.
And I mean, right, the conversation here, not to cut you off, but just to kind of add something to it, right? Because the conversation wouldn't also be complete without also stating that the same owner of Amazon is also the owner of the Washington Post, one of the largest, news organizations in the country, which had a very clear political sort of slant and had a very clear back and forth as well. Not to say that the Trump administration didn't have things that they needed to be held to task for, but when Amazon goes for a contract, for a large government contract, that becomes an interesting issue if they're not awarded that contract to the AWS cloud, and you see all of these retaliations against Trump and his supporters, not only in the media that they own, but on the servers that they run. It really kind of gives you a dystopian feel.
It sounds to me like we're getting into correlating monopolistic behavior and antitrust type law with freedom of speech and censorship.
Well, I mean, the United States government is a capitalistic society, so let's talk about that.
Yeah, but also it's interesting, right? Our society is democratic and capitalism by happenstance, not by design, right? Neither democracy or capitalism are mentioned in our founding documents. So it's like we fell into this. We've designed the system over time, and that's something that's also interesting to think about, right? Our struggle with monopoly is inherently linked to government, right? Government is what makes the ultimate monopoly. It is the ultimate corporate monopoly by definition in many industries. And in some cases that's fine, right? In some cases that's a good thing. In other cases that's a really bad thing. And in the case of speech monopolies, it's obviously a bad thing, right? Like a society in which the government decides what you can and cannot say, or where you can and cannot say something, like in China, is obviously not a good thing or healthy for a society. And I think what's worrisome is not necessarily that our current tech system is built within a capitalist economic system, but that we're so tolerant of monopolies to the point that we are unable to allow for innovation. And that doesn't allow for the complex system to arise, right? You don't get the birth and death and selection that you get in complex adaptive systems, because you can't adapt when you have a government mandated monopoly. And that worries me, right? When Jen Psaki comes out and says point blank that that the White House is giving Facebook the list of names, and that they're going forward and doing the sending a list of names to Facebook to be censored. That's a direct violation of the First Amendment. I mean, can you imagine if that was said 3 years ago, right? If Trump was giving lists of names to Facebook and having them banned and censored, right? There would have been a 7th or 8th impeachment, or however many times they tried to impeach him. And rightly so. They should have impeached him if he were to do that, but he didn't. But the Biden administration did, and it was met with basically media silence across most channels. And it's like, I remember seeing that and thinking, first I saw the headline and I thought it was like bullshit. I was like, there's no way that happened. And then I saw the press conference and saw her say it, and I was like, what reality are we living in where this is not front page of the New York Times?
People freaking out.
Yeah, there's a time to riot, and we're awfully quiet about this, guys.
So on that note, how does a birthing complex system unseat a monopolistic power that owns, for all intents and purposes, the air that any new system might breathe?
Yeah. So basically, there's three ways it can happen, and they directly correlate to the 4 different kinds of complex systems that exist. So, cite Stephen Wolfram's A New Kind of Science. Great book, 1,000 pages, hard to read, but it's great stuff. And he basically looks at 4 classes of complex systems, one of which is stasis, right? Or 4 classes of systems, right? One of them is stasis. It's just the same thing all the time, like completely predictable, right? Like just, you know, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1 forever, right? It's always 1. What's the next thing going to be? It's going to be 1. And in that case, it's stasis. So when a monopoly grows to be too big and it consumes the entire system, it can become you can get stasis, right? You basically get a full lockdown and nothing can happen. Those are kind of rare, but they can happen for long periods of time. In those cases, though, where you have predictability, but then you have waves of randomness, those are considered to be systems on the edge of chaos, right? And you have a healthy amount of randomness, and those are extremely adaptive systems because they're predictive at local scales. Like you'll know that something will happen tomorrow, but you can't say what's going to happen in 4 or 5 years. And that's basically human societies in their most healthy bit. The issue is that, you know, when you predict a few days out, sometimes it's really ugly and sometimes it's really beautiful, and you have to be willing to tolerate the balance of the ugliness and the beauty of any side of the situation in order to understand that long term this is the most stable solution. This is the most stable state for us to be in. And then the other case is a vacillating system, right? A system that just goes 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. It's not always 1, but it's going to go back and forth. Those can be problematic because even though they're extremely predictive, there's no innovation. There's no real change or adaptation. It's always just 1 or 2. And, you know, we can draw an interesting analogy to the fact that, you know, we've gone from a complex, beautiful chaos system to like a 1-2 party system politically, and that at a certain point we might hit stasis, right? And that would be something, depending on whether or not it's right wing or left wing, you effectively either get fascism or communism, in their historical sense, not necessarily in some intellectual debate of what does that even mean, but like in the historical sense, you get one or the other. It either goes right wing authoritarian or left wing authoritarian, and that authoritarianism becomes stasis because you can't change the regime. In reality, you need a healthy amount of chaos to keep things going, and that's the ugly beauty of democracy. You don't get the government you want, you get the government you deserve.
Yeah, and often people don't want chaos either in their personal lives or in their networks, their interpersonal lives, or in their social political lives. They don't have enough tolerance for it, and so they embrace, in some cases, fascism. Less often communism, but still.
Coming from a very different perspective, some wisdom from a wowza that turned into a sticky note. Wowza being, I don't know, an 82-year-old person with more energy than a 20-year-old who's written multiple books and is one of the creators of expressive arts therapy, right? So like very other side of the spectrum, said the value of chaos is breaking loose. So she doesn't have a PhD from Oxford and yet said the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, dude, truth is funny that way. So I think that's one of the things that a lot of times, like when we think of the political systems, right, we're worried about the chaos in a certain way. And I think, you know, this can kind of bring us full circle as maybe an interesting launching point to kind of get into like the events of January 6th, right? Is that for me, understanding January 6th is really predicated on understanding the context in which those events happened. Not like in Washington, D.C. on January 6th, but the socio-cultural context of how that happened, and trying to understand not just like in the way that the media tried to present this, but trying to understand from like the side of the people who were there in all of their variety, right? Because the guy, the QAnon shaman or whatever, the dude who was like there with the bullhorns, is not the same in his beliefs or intentions as like some of those people who were just out there with some signs, right? And their beliefs and intentions weren't the same as we now know, thank you Netflix, that the free Tiger King people were also there and sent like a private jet to the event, right? So like, you know, if we try and lump everyone that was at January 6th into a single bubble, right, we're never going to fully understand what was going on, because we're going to be blaming Tiger King for like, you know, the QAnon shaman sitting in the throne of the Senate and all of that crap. And that's not a valid way. That's not going to get us anywhere to try and understand why people would have been motivated to do that and how we can therefore stop it from getting there again. or understanding how we can move forward and learn from it. Like, we have to be honest about what it was, or else whatever we take away from it's not going to be realistic.
I think one of the whys, or one part of the explanation, has to do with moral foundations, which is that one of the theories that Culture Pulse is able to pick up on the foundations of their moral decisions. And so the difference between conservatives and liberals. So briefly, there's binding foundations and individualizing foundations. And so conservatives will tend to be, let me say it the other way around. Liberals will tend to be especially strong on things being fair and not harming other people, and not as strong on authority or hierarchy or disgust or in-group
Purity.
Impurity, yeah, pure. Whereas for conservatives, all five of those foundations will typically be about the same, which means they still typically don't want to harm people, except in extreme cases, and they want things to be fair, but they think it's equally important that you're loyal to your group. That's to be moral is to be loyal. To be moral is to respect hierarchy, and to be moral is to not do things that are impure, or to be disgusted at things that are problematic. And so this is one of the underlying differences that drives people on the opposite sides of the January 6th event.
I think so. One of the things that's interesting to think of when we frame these events from that psychological standpoint, right, is that the key violation, right, the key moral violation that led to those protests was a violation of a sense of fairness. Right? So it's actually a moral foundation that the left wing also holds. And there's that's interesting to me, right? And just kind of working through this, in real time with you guys, right? It's interesting to me because on the one hand, it suggests that there should have been more empathy to kind of being like, wait, what's up with these guys? But at the same time, right, there was this sort of oh, what do you mean? It wasn't a violation of fairness at all. And the conversation was shut down. And it led to, I think, one, it was literally shut down on social media to the point that echo chambers were created. And that was not good because it led to two entirely different narratives where the only people who really seem to be able to piece together a fair amount of the truth of the matter are people who are kind of trying to listen to two conversations at once. And for anyone who's tried to do that, right, that's not easy to do because you get bits of this and bits of that, and you still don't get the whole thing because you have two different streams. And in this case, it's almost like being overseas, right? Because this is almost like two different languages at this point. If you watch MSNBC and then you watch Fox News or something coming in the other side, it's like two different languages that they're speaking when they discuss this.
And increasingly they discuss each other. So, for example, Fox News will say, Brian Stelter on his supposed show about media did this ridiculous thing. And
I see clips of Tucker Carlson going on all the time, and Brian Stelter's like, then Tucker Carlson, who's an asshole, or whatever. They're just throwing dirt at each other. And I'm
this is news.
Are you guys paid for this as journalists? I think they don't understand the difference between journalism and diaryism, because what they've done is turned reporting into, Dear Diary, today Tucker said something mean about me at school, and I'm not happy. And it's come on, get over yourselves, be adults.
So part of the reason why we named this stream The Demise of Democracy, and part of the reason, as we discussed before we went live, that we're calling this, the anniversary of the event on January 6th, is really to choose a language that does not pick one side. And right, if you call it the insurrection, then you're picking a side. One of the things that we've wondered is what would happen? Justin, you've done research on the most effective way to de-radicalize someone is to have them write an essay about something they don't believe in. And so we've been wondering from that foundation, what would it look like if we incentivized left wing and right wing to come into a shared space for a contained discussion of for this hour, your job is to empathize with someone whom you don't agree with. And facilitating, we've thought of it as a podcast, we've thought of it as a hangout space, but it'd be interesting because the thing that you just said prompted the thought of what would happen if a bunch of corporate sponsors offered a bunch of pundits money, our capitalistic society, to empathize with their contemporary.
Yeah.
And basically had a bounty for Tucker Carlson to for left wing to
talk to right wing.
Right wing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so it's interesting in two senses, right? So the literature suggests that would work. But the literature, from particularly the anthropological standpoint, suggests that the people who are most interested in doing that are the people who need it the least, right? And so this is also true of like interfaith dialogue, when you get like Jews and Muslims in Israel Palestine to talk to one another, is that the people who are most willing to participate in those programs are the people who usually are kind of on board for peace talks anyways, and who you need are the people on the far left and the far right. Now, when you look at the media, there's an interesting pattern that has worried me, because there's a lot more willingness, not just in the media, but in the general population. There have been population-wide surveys done by both Pew and Gallup that show that tendencies to censor are coming more frequently from the left than from the right. And people who are more conservative are more open to talking to people on the left. They're more willing to having friendships and to even date people on the left. But that's not true of the other way around. And the shutdowns you see on social media do tend, both in self-report cases and in a lot of studies, to be those that are generally focused towards the right, which is one of the reasons that the narrative is going the way that it is. You do see articles, Brian, I think you shared an article with me last week, right, that shows that, the right wing is actually being pushed by social media, not censored. And it's like, those are actually not two different things. You can be both pushed and censored more on social media. Those are two different mechanisms on social media, because the social media pushes out sensationalism. And when someone on the right posts something and people on the left go at him, and then he and his buddies on the right go back at it, and they just go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, that's sensationalism. That games the algorithm. So yeah, it is going to be more likely, because there is more sensationalism around right-wing media and right-wing news on social media. So yeah, the idea of having a beer together.
Yeah.
Yeah, it can go a long way, and I think that it's important that we do that. I mean, I try and do that. I try and talk to as many people in as many different places as we can, which is one of the reasons that we've got a good friend here, even though he's on mute because he muted himself and had his camera off here. But we've got, Joe Allen is here listening, and if he has any questions, he'll hit me up on the phone. And I've spoken with Joe. Joe and I have done pieces with The Federalist, which is a more conservative magazine. I went on and I spoke to Steve Bannon at the War Room about AI the other day, which Joe works with. And I think it's a good thing, right, to have that dialogue. I don't agree with everything that was said on the episode I appeared in, but that's not the point. That's not why I was there. I was there to be like, cheerleading. I was there to discuss AI and the role of AI in religion and technology and social media, and that's an important discussion for everybody to have. And so I'd be just as happy to go on MSNBC.
Yeah, like another way to put what you're saying, Justin, to go back a couple of minutes, is that much of the literature suggests that left-wing people are more in-groupish than right-wing people, at least in this context, on these issues, which is part of the broader ongoing discussion that we have on these Wednesdays about how we can have communities and groups, but in ways that are safe, in ways that don't drive toward intergroup conflict in way that people become extreme. And I mean, there are so many factors at work. We're talking before we went on here about the psychological dynamics, and then there's also the interpersonal, the social, political, economic, biological. Just it's so complex, which is why you need complex computational models to get at some of that.
Yeah.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Joe. Go ahead.
I figured out how to turn on my mic. I just had to switch the browser.
There you go.
It doesn't work in Mozilla apparently. So just real quickly, I'm 42 now, so I've seen some change in society, and I think that while I respect Haidt and Graham's moral foundations theory as a general paradigm, what we see now, especially, and you guys, you and Laurent covered it in your paper, you see this sudden shift towards an emphasis on purity, especially ideological purity, and also a shift towards authoritarianism among leftists, which would indicate that maybe the notion that these are simply sort of pre-existent inclinations that will drive or influence human behavior across a population, divergently, right? So the conservatives adhere to in-group loyalty, authority, purity, whereas liberals tend not to. I wonder if it's far more flexible than that, and especially when you look at how things changed, say, from the 90s until now, right? Like in the 90s, liberals might have scoffed at something like the bell curve, or liberals might have scoffed at Pat Buchanan, but he was still welcome, right? And Charles Murray was still welcome. And it wasn't until liberals had a sense that they were dominant, right? That they were controlling not only the politics but also the cultural narrative, that they began to, at least in my experience, and to some extent I could argue historically, it wasn't until they had really started to gain power and get the sense, the feeling that they had power, that they began to behave that way. And concurrently with that, I mean, when Bush Jr. was in power, and even then when Trump was in power, I think conservatives began, when they were flush with a sense that they were in control, they began to eliminate anyone or any idea near them that they felt was a threat to their power, or at least wasn't beneficial to them. And now you see something very different. I mean, the only reason I'm on Steve Bannon's show now, I would say, is because Bannon is a much more open-minded figure than any other kind of conservative personality that I'm aware of. But I think one reason that he's, that conservatives in general and Bannon is kind of cobbling together a much wider spectrum of personalities is because when you're an insurgent sort of political force, you have to really put out your feelers to get whatever sort of whatever allies are available. Whereas when you are in power, you can afford to start, you can have an exclusive guest list, if that makes sense.
So
I don't know if I want to tack something on to what Joe said, just as a question, and I'm curious to know how the balance of power shifts that activity. So Joe specifically talked about like different presidents and how different behaviors manifested when different ideologies were in power. So I'm super curious about that. I think that's what Joe was getting at.
So I'll jump in quick and then let's see what Laurent has to say too. So I think there's a lot to unpack there. On the one hand, I think that when it comes to the work that Laurent and I have done analyzing Twitter and showing that in certain left-wing circles there are significant tendencies towards an actual conservative moral signature, where you do have purity and in-group being more heavily promoted, I think that that's something that has always been there. And one of the things it's not really directly spelled out in the paper for a number of reasons. One of them being, we probably could have written a book about these findings, and we really had to kind of cut it down to paper length. And one of the things that I think that has to do with is we also did an analysis not just of Twitter but of Google books. And we're able to show that these words have very specific time frames where they just explode onto the cultural scene. And they all explode basically together out of the late 80s and early 90s. And so what I think that's doing is that has a lot to do with sort of like that fall in the postmodernist dialogue in universities and a sort of reframing of that towards a lot of the rise of what you see in the humanities and the social sciences in particular that is very related to Marxism. And Marxism being a left-wing authoritarianism, because it does specifically mandate authority in group and a certain amount of purity as well as a heavy discussion in hierarchy and who has and has not the power, that you do start to see a reframing of that. And it just got more, I think, because it came out of an educational institution, it was able to become more pervasive in the culture online once social media set in. But there's also, during all of this happening, right, you mentioned some of the presidents, and I think whenever there's a president in power, the president in power is going to try and do whatever he can in order to try and push a specific ideology or agenda as far as he wants to. and can also get away with. And when you have both the House, the Senate, and the presidency, you can push a lot more, right, without there being too much pushback. And there were certain mechanisms in the democracy in the U.S. that we had where, there wasn't the nuclear option to end filibusters, and there wasn't even a discussion of ending a filibuster, because the filibuster was considered fundamental to protecting minority rights in our system. And now whoever's in power seems to be okay with getting rid of the filibuster so long as they're in power. And there's been a lot of instances, both Republican and Democrat, of them, suggesting that it's okay to do one thing when they're in power, but it being completely unacceptable when the other person's in power. And that is a sort of childish approach to politics that gets really dangerous, because then it becomes less about the complex adaptive system and the boundaries that we put on our model of politics, if you will, and it becomes more about the agents and the egos that inhabit those aspects of the complex adaptive system, right? And I think we need to try and use, democracy and capitalism are useful insofar as they become ways of exploring the different possibilities efficiently, so that we can find the one that fits best in a specific context, and then change it later when we need to. When democracy and capitalism don't do that, those institutions start to break down pretty quickly.
If I can use your reference to context there, Justin, as a segue, I think I agree with what Joe was saying. I do think that, especially in the U.S., when one group is in power, it starts to behave in the ways that you described. But as you were talking, I was thinking about my experience in Norway. I was born and raised in the U.S., but have lived now in Norway for the last 15 years. And so in Norway, when one government is in power, they don't act, they try to get through what they can get through, but they don't act the same way as it happens in the U.S. So it's more of a parliamentary system where you have to cobble together different people who may not agree with you completely in order to get things done. And of course, there's other differences, the homogeneity of the culture in Norway. But it seems like at least at that dimension, or on that parameter, it's somewhere closer to the chaos that Justin was talking about earlier. It's not just 1, 1, 1, 1 or 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2 as in the U.S. But there's enough chaos, if I can put it that way, in the Norwegian political system and public discourse that there's more room for negotiation and interaction. Of course, the downside there, or not the downside, but there is not as much innovation in some senses in Norway as in the U.S. I don't think this necessarily has to do with the political system, but possibly the level of regulation over the economic and corporate system. But that would take us down a different road. But the key point I'm trying to raise here is it really does depend on context and culture, and even the history, the political regime that's upon which a particular nation, state, or culture has arisen, that will affect how people in power are going to react to the people who, once they do achieve control of the government.
Question, Joe, Luron, Justin, non sequitur, but just got a little bit of a brief on sort of what the topics are. What are your beliefs about the viability of actually decentralized tooling? DoWs have become a buzzword in recent days, but there's obviously just Discord chats right now. There's no real governance yet, but I will say that I bet Q1, Q2 this year, some people are pretty close to releasing functionality that would really kind of galvanize large groups based around common NFT interests or whatever, that in my humble opinion have the ability to disrupt larger organizations. So thoughts?
Yeah, I would say they definitely have the ability to disrupt larger organizations, and I think that's their beauty. I think more likely they will also be adopted by larger organizations as well. But I think the cool thing is that technologies like DAOs and just the crypto space in general, right? It creates a lower barrier to entry to create a new system or a new entity. than other things, right? Much like the computer, like, allowed a guy to create a product from his couch, like,
Yeah.
if he had the information. And DAOs are interesting because you can create these organizations that, in a way, mimic the internet itself, because all of our organizations or social organizations have struggled in the last like 20 years with the fact that our lives are no longer just in like the flesh and blood, but a lot of our lives and communication happen online, and they happen in this virtual space. And so the DAOs, I mean, I would say that the nature of crypto generally is, taking, or rather cryptocurrencies, we're taking finance and putting them on the internet, like really doing it. PayPal kind of tried, but it also kind of failed. And I think, Bitcoin was the internet of currency. And that's why I'm hopeful for Bitcoin, but I also kind of compare it to like the Ask Jeeves of cryptocurrency, because the big kickers of other cryptocurrencies are coming. And I think DAOs are an interesting example of what happens in the next stage, because that's taking our social organizations and the ideas of democracy and making them, and that's like the internet of democracy. And that's a really interesting concept, right? Because it's both, it has the potential to be beautiful and terrifying.
The risk you run, right, with freedom.
Dude, right? Exactly. With a lot of liberty comes a lot of responsibility, and that's just the way it always is. And you always have to balance it. You can't just always have one. If you have all the liberty and no responsibility, people get taken advantage of. And if you have all this responsibility and no liberty, you're going to burn out, and it just feels authoritarian. And so, we have to balance both worlds. And the issue is that you can't seesaw. You just need to go up with both. You just need to hold full bags.
How can
Sam,
you
you had a
not?
question too, though.
How can you not have hope in Bitcoin? He's so cute. He's so cute.
Oh, I have hope in your Bitcoin. That is a very cute dog, and still one of
For
the
those who are
greatest
just
names for a
joining,
dog.
the Bitcoin that's currently being discussed is a fuzzy one that is K9
He's
on the K9 chain.
Cheagle.
Sam, you had a question a bit ago?
Yeah, with when Laurent was talking about the political systems in Norway, and very much like the idea that in Norway and in a lot of parts in the world, it is not a two-party system. And I'm wondering, like, what is our path out of this two-party system? Because that kind of seems to be the crux of the issue that we're having, is it's either left or it's right. There is no other option. And anytime that other option develops to a point that it has any sort of like weight to it, it immediately gets swallowed up by left or right, and then can get squashed. I mean, big companies buy out small companies just to put them out of business all the time.
Yeah, and I think that that's one of the things. There's also this other dimension, right, of sort of centralized and decentralized. And as things go right and left, they also can become centralized or decentralized. And when things are decentralized, when they go right or left, it's kind of okay, because if you don't like it, right, there's not a central authority forcing you into it. You still can make your own choices to a certain extent. But when it becomes overly centralized, when someone goes right, you're like, damn, I don't like what he's doing, and it does affect me, and I have to pay into this guy's system in order to make it happen. And when it goes, and that happens in both directions. And I think that's one of the reasons why we see this sort of anger in the U.S. social media landscape today that kind of led to January 6th, right? To kind of keep us circling back here, is that there was a lot of anger about that, because the idea was, look, we don't want to live under that regime. And then there's also the idea that the election itself was not fair, right? And therefore, because it was not fair, we should not have to live under this next regime. And then there's also this kind of idea of like, well, you lived under our guy, so we have to live under your guy. And this idea of like, just deal with it, sort of a thing. And that's not a very healthy way for a democracy to live. So I think one of the interesting questions that I'll pose to Laurent is, well, I have two questions, but one of them is like hot controversial, so I don't know if I even want it. Like, even I'm like,
we're almost out of time.
Okay, so a lot of reports, right, have looked at January 6th as an insurrection. and as an act of terrorism, and terrorism being defined by the FBI, right, as an act of violence or intimidation aiming to achieve political ends. So if January 6th was an insurrection or act of terrorism, why is it that January 6th is being treated that way, but the Black Lives Matter riots and Antifa riots of the previous 8 months leading up to the insurrection were not?
Yeah, weren't you? Didn't you tell me, Justin, that even
great
from an
question.
economic point of view,
That's a great fucking question.
yeah, just from an economic point of view, the BLM movements cause a lot more damage.
Billions more in damage. Yeah, I saw estimates of several billion on the low end of damage being caused by the riots. Right, when you look at the way in which the fallout was also covered by the media, right? Like if you look at the Kyle Rittenhouse trial versus the trial or non-trials of the people that are going through January 6th, like you don't see them being dragged out. You see really kind of like, this is our narrative. It was an insurrection. These people were terrorists. Like, you know, anything that happened, like it was, you know, they made it seem like it was this much larger event, I think, than it really was. I mean, we had, and don't get me wrong, right? I'm not a fan of what happened. Like, I would say that the people who crossed into the Senate, that was an act of terrorism, right, in my mind. But I'm confused when I look at that, and then I also look at people literally declaring independent states and independent like city states in Portland, in Seattle, in St. Louis, and that not being like, that is the definition of an insurrection. And yet we didn't treat it the same way. And I worry that without looking at these things comparatively and rationally, that we're ensuring that something like this will happen again. And if we don't learn from it now, we risk it being worse when it does happen again.
Yeah, even facilitating it, unfortunately.
Exactly.
Happen again
Yeah.
in like the near future.
Yeah, and I think to go back to Sam's comment and question, like what would it take to break out of the the two-party system, Sam? You know, I've thought about that a lot. I don't have a good, clear answer. I mean, one is revolution, violence, but then it would probably go to 1-1. To go back to Justin's example earlier, I mean, the system
Exactly.
was controlling one way or another. But I mean, the only way I can see it happening peacefully, and I just have to say, I don't mean to be pessimistic, but I don't know if there's time for it to happen peacefully, or if the conditions are such that it can happen. I mean, I hope it does, but there would have to be people in the middle who are able to put as much energy as the people on the right and the left into building coalitions, groups within that middle, and not caving into the pressure on either side. And that takes psychological energy, it takes finances, it takes a sense of safety. It takes all the things we were discussing.
It takes a lot of identity work, because
Can
the identities
Can we start the Unity Party?
You
Well,
could.
you know,
How would it be different than Yang's Forward Party?
If I may, I think this is really the heart of the problem. Is, you know, you have, I think both Black Lives Matter and you know, the larger MAGA movement, and you know, the various sort of immigrant coalitions, all of them are, while they do have their financiers, they are really decentralized populist movements for the most part. You know, in much of the Bernie Sanders left is a decentralized populist movement. And I think that, you know, those sorts of movements, however viable or not they do pose a threat to, you know, any sort of central control, right? You always have these rowdies on the fringe holding you to account, hopefully, you know, ideally. But I think in America, you know, it's in the rapid transition from the fairly, you know, homogenous society of, say, the 60s and even the 70s to the, you know, very wildly diverse population, even, you know, among the homogenous groups that existed in that, you know, early era, they have all sort of fractured culturally, and certainly insofar as what they believe to be true and not to be true, or what they believe to be valuable and not to be valuable. And so without any sort of middle ground, it's very difficult to imagine what sort of, you know, compromises and unity could really occur. At this point, it just seems like you have this enormous vehicle for power in DC and also in, you know, the various corporations that run America. And the scramble seems to be among all these different factions to, you know, seize control of those systems, or at least to wield as much influence as possible over them, knowing good and well that that system will then cast a shadow on all the other sort of opposing groups.
Joe, I'd be curious to know what you think. Do you think if Americans in general, I mean the broader population, felt more safe, and by that I mean, just to put it bluntly, they knew they could count on health care, they felt like they would know where their next meal is coming from, the kind of the typical existential security questions that sociologists use to measure countries. Do you think if people felt calmer and safer, that would at least help overcome some of the polarization?
It would probably help, sure, but you know, really, you know, Scott Atran's position on this is pretty compelling to me, and I really do think that the deontological sort of focus on value is really the issue here. I don't think anyone's really starving to death in America by and large. You know, and those who are not the ones, you know, that are trying to mobilize people to take on the larger system, or to, you know, maintain competition with any of the smaller groups, the smaller ethnic or political or, you know, religious groups. So I really do think it's largely a matter of identity, and I think it's a matter of pride, and it's a matter of territorialism, and because everything has shifted online so much, you know, it's by and large like a scramble for control of that. As much as physical territory or actual economic and political territory. So, but I guess, sorry to go on too long, I fear that it's really not a matter of economic security. I fear that it's really more of a matter of, you know, what people believe and what they believe to be real and true and valuable.
It's interesting you mentioned that too, because I've read studies that that we throw away enough food to basically feed the entire world every year in the European Union and United States, right? So it's a lot of things, like, it's not a matter of hunger, particularly not in the United States, right? There's plenty of food to go around, but there is this identity component. And in some of the simulation work that Laurent and I have done, when you see schisms where one group splits into two, it can be over ideological divisions. The way that you get those two groups to come back together is in one of two ways. In one way, you basically have to lower the threshold of intolerance, right? And to an extent, the threshold of intolerance is one that's based in context and how stressed you are. And then in other cases, there's like kind of like a biological lower limit of like, you're always going to be somewhat intolerant of other people because they are not you or your direct kin, right? So there's also this evolutionary issue that's hard for us to overcome. But then the other way of doing it is by highlighting specific central beliefs that both groups hold in common. And this, I think, is the only way at an information level to do this. And actually, it's where social media becomes a possible tool rather than the absolute destruction of modern civilization, is that you can use it to highlight beliefs that people on both the right and the left, and I'm thinking pretty far actually into those margins, agree on. And in some cases, right, we start with things like harm and fairness that both the right and the left have moral beliefs about, right? So things like everyone being equal, like, the idea all men are created equal and all of this sort of thing, making sure that, like, that's one American ideal that is attached to a sort of moral dilemma that goes to the right and the left, and making sure that it's actually discussed. Making sure that it's discussed, though, in a healthy and open and realistic and rational way is kind of the issue when you look at the Twitter discussion around this, for example, is that it's just basically gone off the rails, and you can't even have certain conversations there. And that's one of the reasons I think that, like, a much more, oddly enough to say the word, liberal approach to free speech is needed on Twitter, because their very authoritarian approach towards censorship is hurting the very debates that we need to be having by making them one-sided and not including everyone in the debate, when in fact Twitter could be an actual really interesting platform to help us to to create the losses that we basically have experienced. Reddit is interesting because it just encapsulates everybody in these really interesting interest groups, and you kind of break your echo chamber because you don't exist in one chamber. You are your own betweenness metric in a network. The other thing that can help, and this is something that is, depending on your country, more or less controversial, is getting us out of these lockdowns as quickly as possible. Because having face-to-face conversations, there's literally like neurotransmitters that can be measured that happen when we have face-to-face conversations, when we hug one another, when we laugh with each other, right? Like having that in person just does not doing this online is just not the same as doing it in person. And we used to have a modern way of breaking the echo chamber, right? It was Thanksgiving, right? Having to tolerate that racist uncle, or having to like shut down your grandpa when he says something about Colin Kaepernick, right? Dealing with your liberal arts, art history major cousin. Like, these were the things that broke our echo chamber, and we dealt with them because we loved them because they're family. And every single year you had to put up with that and whatever that green jello thing was that your grandmother made.
The
And
pandemic has really
and that
made
was
it
the
worse,
beauty
yeah.
of family, right? That was the beauty of sociality and of like the American traditions of like 4th of July and Thanksgiving and whatever religious holiday you usually celebrate. But having those sorts of things were great. The rites of passages of like, summer barbecues in your neighborhood, block parties, man, like getting out and knowing people in your neighborhood. Like most people I know who live in cities in the US wouldn't ask their neighbor for a cup of sugar. Like when I grew up and you needed a cup of sugar, like you sent your kid alone to go knock on the unlocked door of your neighbor and ask them for sugar. And the answer was just always yes, right? And to an extent, like, there's certain things that we need to do to make sure that we're still safe in the world, right? But at the same time, we need to understand the world is getting safer. And when you look at the data on crime statistics, which have been going steadily down for decades, and the divergence of how much you think crime is in your neighborhood going steadily up, that stopped, and it was parallel for years. And then as soon as broadband internet started getting mass adoption in the United States, that's when you see the split, right? So this is the exact split. When broadband internet goes from nobody to start dropping and jumping up above 10% of the population, you all of a sudden start to see a divergence between actual crime rates and perceived crime rates in the United States. And this idea of we no longer live in a safe neighborhood is, scientifically speaking, right, the word for it is bullshit.
Yes,
Like,
yes.
we do live in safe neighborhoods
So
in
it's a
America.
kind of
I live in
it's a perceived-
Bratislava, which is like a utopian paradise in crime rates compared to anything in the United States. I'm not going to lie to you guys. This place is, nobody worries about anything here. But even in the United States, the crime rates have been going down for the most part. 2020, oddly enough, is the big outlier. That was when crime has been spiking. And the reason crime has been spiking is because people lost their shit. Like, people went a little nuts because they were locked into their house, they were stir crazy, things started to go sideways, debates didn't make sense anymore, people started fighting, they weren't sure where they'd have their job, where they were going to get their food, and that does make people a little stir crazy. It gets people going in a way, and it supercharges the issues that are already there, I think, to a breaking point. And then, of course, you also have areas of particularly underserved communities in the cities, right, which were already struggling. Like, if you guys have been to the area off of Route 40 in Baltimore before the pandemic and after the pandemic, there's no difference. It was a horrible place. It was a third world country before the pandemic came. And the pandemic just made these things even worse, right? And it had been that way for years, which is why you see things in places like St. Louis and Baltimore like you did when Freddie Gray was murdered, right? You saw those big riots happening there because people were done. People were fed up because there had been serious injustices in Baltimore for decades, and people snapped. And that's what we saw in 2020 as well, and people started snapping. And I think it's one of those things that, we need to start opening up these lockdowns quickly for social reasons and doing them safely. And we know how to do these safely from a health perspective, right? The doctors are there. They're kicked off of Twitter, but they're there. And I think that, we can have these conversations and we can make them face to face again and start healing the wounds that have happened from this lockdown.
Same discussion in Norway too. I agree, Justin. I actually have to run, but everybody feel free to obviously continue.
Same, I actually do
See you
too.
around.
I do too.
Hey,
It's dinner
y'all,
time
before
here.
y'all go, I did want to speak something really quickly that I find a little
Yeah.
bit problematic that happened a couple minutes ago. Just because there was such a positive reaction to what you said, Justin, I want to bring this up. That I think it's
Yeah.
really inappropriate to compare apples to apples what happened on January 6th to what happened in the aftermath of the BLM protest. Strictly because the motivations and the fragilities involved with the people are completely different. You know, and I'm not saying this to justify that one event was more ethical or better than the other, but like I just think it's really problematic to like compare them exactly. You know, and that has to do with the validation thing. You know, it's like I think it's really important. Like if we're gonna give space to what happened on January 6th and the motivations of the people there and understanding why they acted that way and why that happened, we should do the same thing also for understanding why the protesters of BLM, you know, took such
Yeah.
crazy, you know, actions. Yeah, I think, yeah, that I just wanted to thank you
It's
for
a
letting me
great
say
idea.
that.
I'd love to do that. Maybe
So-
next week we can do that.
We
Cool.
could. Also, I would also say I see that point, by the way, and I think it's a fair point. I definitely would say that, you know, it would be wrong to say apples to apples. I would say that at a certain level in definition, they're both fruits, to use the analogy.
Okay.
But I think, you know, having an open like a very clear definition of how one defines fruits is
Okay.
kind of why one can put them in the same basket. But I
Okay.
would agree that they're not. I like Laurent slowly walking away. But I think and I'm gone now, like Homer Simpson fading into the bushes. But I would say that definitely at a certain level they are fruits. So it'd be interesting to kind of explore the fruits.
Yeah, I think having that discussion is fine, but like, yeah, we had just like so quickly gone over it, and I saw some folks' reaction in here so positive towards it that like I wanted to bring that up. That I think like we really need to dig into understanding what were the fragilities involved of why people made those decisions and acted in the way that they did before we compare them. Yeah. So.
No, I
thank you.
think that that's interesting. That would be an interesting topic actually too, because there's a lot of influence of social media and misconceptions and misperceptions in how they were covered and the reactions, and like just from top to bottom, it was like the whole nature of BLM in 2020, which goes well before it too, because I remember having these conversations years ago with my grandfather about Colin Kaepernick and the taking a knee protests, and like how they're framed in the media and discussed is like it's one of those places where like, right, we need that Thanksgiving table to kind of like, but we need to not just like ignore the uncle. We need to kind of like talk to him and see what's up.
Yeah,
But
definitely.
very cool, guys. No, I think that's a good one. That was a good call out.
Thank you.
I'm gonna head out. It is late. It is dinner time. I'm going to go have some venison and whiskey.
Oh, nice. Enjoy, Justin.
Bye bye. Enjoy.
See you
Bye,
guys. Talk soon.
everybody. See ya.
Ciao.
You're on then.
Bye.
Joe,
Ciao. Bye.
Yep.
what do you do?
Say again.
What do you do?
I'm a writer primarily. I also I work at the War Room with Bannon. Who are you?
I'm just a nobody, but curious observer. So you're talking about the idea of like
Cucumber.
Twitter before. My background is in like anonymous social networking. I'm currently doing like DeSo related projects.
All right, I'm
And
gonna
the
walk away
issue
from
that
this
keeps coming up fundamentally,
conversation.
like I'm the biggest proponent.
Yeah, I gotta walk away from that conversation. Yeah, cucumbers to tangerines. I guess that's a good comparison. Yeah, I'm just kind of sensitive. I guess that's the feminine energy in me. I had to call that out. I couldn't not call that out. Yeah, to like directly compare, you know, why did the January 6th participants get treated differently than the BLM participants? I think it's very different. Very, very different. But yeah, 1 year out. We're 1 year out from what happened on January 6th. That was a cool discussion. I did want to ask some more questions. Maybe I can bring it up in another another time that we meet. But I did want to ask some other questions about the involvement of church organizations in a lot of the movements that happened with January 6th, the mobilization that happened in January 6th. Yeah, because I've recently heard a lot about that. But another time, another week. We meet every week. This group is called Practicing Safe Sex. We meet in Topia, and I do stream across several different platforms, so you'll have the opportunity to engage with these conversations. In this forum, I'm nothing but an entrepreneur and nothing but a metaverse media creator. I've felt a very strong responsibility in bringing the feminine energy towards these conversations, because as you see with the participants in that conversation, all very intelligent people, very qualified, intelligent people that know what they're talking about, but you could see they're all one demographic, one very close demographic. And I'm not too far off from that demographic. I'm still a white woman, but at least I'm a woman. And doing the work of deconstructing a lot of these issues from an angle that a white cis hetero male would be a lot more challenged in taking on. So next week, same time, we start at 11 a.m. Pacific, and if y'all want to join the actual conversation, you are welcome. Everybody is welcome. This is an open forum. It's not an exclusive forum that you only get to see from the outside, from Reddit or from Twitch, but you can actually come to these meetings. Just next time you come in the chat, you can ask for the link. I'll post the link right now as well, so if you want to write this down and remember it to come next time. But the URL is topia.io/citizens. Should be in the chat now. I chatted it. It should be there. And you want to join from a Chrome browser. That's going to be your best bet, and from a computer. If you come from mobile, it'll be audio only for you, which is fine if that's all you have access to. But if you want to have the fully immersive experience, come from a computer. And all are welcome. Any level of expertise and experience in these topics. We always talk about the intersection of technology with society, with sociology. So always a very interesting subject, which regardless of your background, regardless of your education, regardless of your experience, you are going to have something to say. I mean, dang it, this is about how we live our lives. Like, I think we all have the ability to say something on that. So please come back for more of these conversations, the more perspectives that are included in here, the broader, we expand the demographic of voices here, the more productive these conversations will become, including a political spectrum as well, and that I think that was kind of the thesis of today's conversation, that if we do want to eliminate the risk of radicalization and of extreme events like what happened on January 6th, we would be well served in investing in more inclusive conversations between more voices, instead of creating these echo chambers, as somebody had mentioned earlier, who mentioned that 9,000 Y baby punt. Thanks for bringing that up. And thanks everybody that participated in chat. Always appreciated. Premise Land, thank you for those bits and everybody hanging out with us. I will be back on Twitch tomorrow with our Tea Talks conversation, and then Friday with Best Life Friday, where we do a deep dive into a specific topic, usually something related to psychology, of how we can kind of learn how we can make better decisions for ourselves in creating our own best life. So with that, I say goodbye. Happy Wednesday to you all. Happy Hump Day. And I hope you have a great rest of your productive week. And happy 2022.